of this lengthy series, this long journey through the Gospel of John. And we have encountered incredible episodes thus far. Last week, we arrived at the start of the climax of John chapters 7 and 8. And of course, these two chapters, we said, are a unit. This is the large section, this section here of John's Gospel, where it's from John chapter 7 all the way through chapter 11, is this third and final ministry that Christ had in Judea before going to the cross. And so it's a very lengthy section. He was not expected to go to Judea because we learned right at the outset of John chapter 7 that he did not walk in Judea. Why? They were threatening to kill him. And so this is the last 6 months before the Passion Week. And it began with this trip in John chapter 7 to the Feast of Tabernacles. And again, many people wondered if Jesus would even attend the feast because things were so hostile. Yes? Oh, okay, yeah. It'll be obvious in just a minute. Go ahead 2 slides, and then it'll become obvious after, because I'll announce the introduction of each verse. So Jesus goes to the feast, and of course we know that he spoke twice at the feast. About the middle of the feast, he surprised everyone by just suddenly stepping out of the shadows, and he began to teach the crowd. And of course, if you remember from a couple weeks ago, the temple guards, they came to arrest Jesus. But the day ended with no arrest and Jesus kind of going back into the shadows. Then we had the last and great day of the feast. Right after the people had celebrated that ceremony of the pouring out of the water from the pool of Siloam, Jesus stood up and invited all who were thirsty to come to him and drink, to believe in Jesus. And this time, the temple guards not only failed to arrest Jesus, but they actually went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees to report that no one ever spoke like this man. Well, of course, that didn't please the Pharisees. They lashed out at them, taking this as a personal betrayal. And then one of their own, Nicodemus, interjected that it's their custom to give a man a fair hearing before judging him. And of course, this also just outrages the Pharisees and the chief priests. And they resort to the argument that no prophet would ever arise from Galilee, even though Jonah and Nahum probably did. And so this question of Galilean origins had come up a couple of times already among the arguments from the crowd. But rather than Nicodemus answering his colleagues, Jesus, who had apparently followed the temple guards back to the leaders, suddenly just steps out of the crowd and he says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." We mentioned last week how Jesus was alluding to Isaiah 9, verse 2, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And this is significant because in John 1, these same religious leaders went out to John the Baptist to give him a fair hearing. John identified who he was by appealing to Isaiah 40. Jesus does the same in John 8:12 at the climax of the 2 chapters. And we're going to have a climax. We've hit the climax. Now it's going to be kind of declining action all throughout the rest of chapter 8. But Jesus had to go to them to force a hearing. And when he got there, he appeals to Isaiah to identify himself to the Jewish leaders. So as we continue in the text, we hear no more from Nicodemus. But notice how his colleagues, these religious leaders, these Pharisees, these high priests, notice how they respond to Jesus in verse 13. So the Pharisees said to him, "You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true." Now again, this verse begins with this development marker. It's John's signal that a new speaker is entering the scene. The Pharisees are now directly addressing Jesus for the first time in the chapter. Now think this through with me for a moment. Why would the Pharisees respond to Jesus with this particular question? Jesus has identified, he has testified that he's the fulfillment of Isaiah 9:2, the light coming into the world so that people don't have to walk in darkness. We might expect the Pharisees to stay on the argument against Galilean prophets. But that was a question that was raised by Nicodemus and answered by Christ. So they seem to leave that alone. Now that Christ has entered the scene, the Pharisees have no further interest in the suggestions of Nicodemus because, ironically, Jesus has forced the very hearing that Nicodemus suggested they give him. But what do the Pharisees have in mind with this question? You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Well, we've already seen in chapter 7 how really John chapter 5 is the background to chapter 7, because it was in chapter 5 that Jesus healed the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, just outside the temple compound wall. And that is why they were trying to kill him, because he healed the man on the Sabbath, he told the man to carry his bed, and third, he verbalized his equality with God. That didn't make any friends in Jerusalem among the chief priests and the Pharisees. Those religious leaders never forgot that episode. And if you recall how John 5 unfolded, after the anger of the leaders was aroused from verses 19 all the way through 47 of John chapter 5, Jesus delivered that lengthy speech that was a feast of rich Christology. The Apostle John, back in chapter 5, he never recorded any response from the Pharisees to what Jesus said there in those lengthy verses in John 5. But here in chapter 8, they in essence quote Jesus from chapter 5, verse 31, where Jesus said, "If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true." It is as though these leaders sat around for the many months that Jesus was back in Galilee, and they conspired together around the idea that if Jesus was ever to stand in their presence again, they were going to call him out on this statement, sort of as a trap. I think they probably pre-planned this. And I think they would have put this question to Jesus no matter what he said to them. Jesus had said, "If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true." So here in chapter 8, they quote his words back to him. You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. And this appeal from the Pharisees, the statement they make here, quoting the words of Jesus, I mean, this is all based on Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, which says, "On the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness." And so they built all kinds of rules on this principle. If you have a hearing and someone is before you in a hearing, you've got to have 2 witnesses. Now, what is missing here in John chapter 8, as these Pharisees respond, what is missing is the full statement of Jesus from back in chapter 5. Jesus went on to point out how John the Baptist also testified of Jesus. And then, of course, the Father in heaven testified of Jesus through the miraculous works. And then finally, Moses himself testified of Jesus, and that had they believed Moses, then they would believe in Jesus. But here in John 8, they only call to mind this one statement of Jesus from chapter 5. And they attempt to argue that Jesus is alone in his testimony about himself, and therefore it's false. But again, there's irony here. When the same body of Pharisees 3 years earlier went out to interview John the Baptist back in John chapter 1, John testified to them alone by himself that he was the fulfillment of Isaiah 40, a voice crying in the wilderness. John did appeal to the fact that among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, whose sandal I'm not worthy to untie. So he does allude to somebody else who will testify about him, but he was alone when he was interviewed. So the Pharisees apparently had no objections to John the Baptist testifying alone about himself, but here they do with Jesus. They're trying to trap him. In John chapter 8, these same Pharisees accused Jesus of giving false testimony because he testifies about himself alone, without witnesses. He came alone, and he stands in front of them alone. He didn't bring any other witnesses with him. Now, this is also ironic in light of the interview that Nicodemus had with Jesus in John chapter 3. The very first thing that Nicodemus told Jesus was that they knew he had come from God because of the miracles. So they conceded through Nicodemus in chapter 3 that Jesus was not alone in his testimony. But now here in chapter 8, they accuse Jesus of being alone in his testimony. Why? Well, again, picture it. He's standing there alone before them in a forced hearing, the sort of context where people normally would be expected to bring others to testify. And we're going to see when we get to chapter 9, this is an example. Remember the man born blind? The man's parents were brought to that hearing to formally testify, so there wasn't just one witness. But here in John chapter 8, Jesus stood there alone before them, so they try to exploit that. They attempt to exploit the words of Jesus from chapter 5 as though he was on trial for the effect that it's going to have on anyone who witnesses this scene. Here you have a man alone, he's testifying alone, so that goes against their rules, so he must be giving a false testimony. But notice verse 14 as Jesus answers. Notice the text. Jesus answered, "Even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from, and where I am going, but you do not know where I come from or where I am going." Jesus begins his defense here not by appealing to other human witnesses like Moses or John the Baptist, like he did back in John chapter 5. He, in essence, starts with a hypothetical. Even if he were to be alone in his testimony, even though we know he isn't, but he is saying that for the sake of argument, if he was bearing witness about himself, so because he knows where he came from and where he is going, his testimony, by definition, is a true testimony. In other words, he is telling them that because he dwelt in the realm of heavenly light with God the Father, and he came from there and will be going back there, that position, that access to God can only be real if he is a person of absolute truth. You know, think about it. No liar can dwell in harmony with the Father in heaven. So Jesus is not belittling the law here. You know, the law was a safeguard given to humans who dwell in a sin-cursed world where liars could give false testimony. And so as a safeguard, no liar could come alone and give false testimony so that somebody could be put to death. There has to be some other witness. Jesus is saying here that his access to the Father and his heavenly dwelling place assures absolute truth. It is a place in heaven there where the earthly law of Moses is not needed to ensure truthful testimony. And so really this response of Jesus, this is very high Christology. He is telling them he has absolute authority because of his position. He is free to come from the Father and free to go back to the Father. He has access to a place where the law of Moses is not needed to keep truth and honesty. So now notice as Jesus continues in verse 15, notice the text. He says, "You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one." What Jesus means here is that they are judging him under the presumption that he is merely a sinful man in a sin-cursed world. So he has violated the law for standing there alone giving testimony as to who he is. The term flesh here is sarx. If you remember back in our prologue, John 1:14, the Apostle John said, the Logos, the Word, Jesus Christ, became sarx, flesh. But the Pharisees refused to consider that the eternal Logos would become flesh. All they see is a man standing before them whom they believe to be a sinner and an impostor. They believe he's a maverick rabbi stirring up trouble for them. And so they judge him on that basis. Jesus then ends verse 15 with the counter that he judges no one. Now, what does he mean by that? You know, we know that at Christ's first coming, he came to save, not to judge. We know he'll definitely judge when he comes again. But that's probably not what he has in mind here. You know, the Pharisees are judging based on the presumption of the sinful flesh. This means that by definition, they are not judging Jesus correctly. They judge him with a false and misguided judgment based on wrong presuppositions. Jesus is saying that here that he does not judge people wrongly the way the Pharisees judge. The Pharisees, they hear a matter, they listen to witnesses, and then they give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Jesus doesn't judge anyone that way because of his unique relationship to God the Father. Notice verse 16 as he explains further. He says, "Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me." So it's not to be misunderstood here. Jesus tells them that he judges no one, and he doesn't judge the way the Pharisees judge, because when he does judge, his judgments are in fact true judgments. Why? It's his connection to the Father who sent him. This is the argument that Jesus has been making all along. The Father's judgment is the same as the Son's judgment. The Son's judgment is the same as the Father's judgment. In fact, it's the same judgment. So Christ can tell them he is not judging alone. He is in full harmony with the Father who sent him. Now here in verse 16, Jesus is arguing along the same lines he did back in chapter 5, but only after first raising the bar on his Christology. It's his origin and his destination. That is where the Mosaic law is not needed to maintain sound legal judgments in a sin-cursed context. So in an absolute sense, his testimony about himself stands true, even though he stands there alone before them. But now Jesus appeals directly to the Father again, reminding the Pharisees that he is not alone. Then starting in verse 17, Jesus pivots the argument back to the Mosaic law to show them that his own testing is also, his own testimony here is also true, even by the standard of the law of Moses. Notice the text, verse 17. "In your law it is written that the testimony of two people is true." Now, we've already looked at that verse from Deuteronomy. But it's interesting here that Jesus calls the law your law. Now, commentators debate what exactly Jesus had in mind here, given that, God gave the law to Moses, and in the first century, the Jews were still under that law. So why didn't Jesus say our law? Well, it seems likely here that Jesus calls it your law to highlight the Pharisees' appeal that the testimony of a lone individual is false. In essence, Jesus is returning to their reaction, their question, when Jesus announced that he was the light of the world. Jesus is saying to them, in your appeal to the law, that the testimony of two people is true. But also by calling it your law, Jesus also reaffirms his own position with the Father as the giver of the law from a heavenly place that requires no law for perpetual righteousness and holiness. And so he's distinct from the law. He's the giver of the law. He's not under the law in the same sense. Finally, in verse 18, Jesus returns to the argument that he made back in chapter 5, that even under the constraint of the law given to deal with the sinful flesh, even under that standard, his testimony is true. Notice the text, verse 18. "I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me." So do you see what he's doing? Jesus goes right back to the argument that Nicodemus had conceded back in chapter 3. And we keep going back to that encounter because I believe to properly understand John's gospel, you have to feel the weight of that encounter in John chapter 3. That's critical. It's a critical foundation to understand the rest of the book. Because what Nicodemus does there is he affirms that they already know that Jesus has to be from God because of the miracles. The works of Jesus bear witness of the Father. Nicodemus told Jesus that they, not just him, they knew he was from the Father. No one can do these kind of works unless the Father is with him. And so Jesus verbally testifies about himself as to who he is. And then the Father who sent Jesus also testifies through the miracles. Jesus here, what he's done, he has fully exposed the Pharisees for their irrational unbelief. I call it irrational unbelief because they saw the miracles happen with their own eyes, and yet they refused to believe. So how do these unbelieving Pharisees respond? I'll notice verse 19. "They said to him, therefore, "Where is your Father?" You see what the Pharisees just did here? It was obvious from the context Jesus was speaking about his Father in heaven. He's done this before. This isn't new. They refused to admit this publicly, even though Nicodemus conceded it privately. They will not accept that Jesus came from God the Father. And so what they do is they try to force Jesus into talking about his physical, earthly Father. Now, some commentators suggest that the Pharisees were just simply confused, because later in verse 27, we'll get there next week, it does say that they didn't understand that he was talking about the Father. But you have to follow the text carefully. By verse 27, he's not talking to or about the Pharisees and the high priests, these religious leaders. He's talking about the other group called the Jews. So the Jews were confused, but I don't believe that these leaders were confused. They study the law. They know what Jesus has been claiming all along. They get it. They just refuse to believe it. But it was that response to the Jews. When they didn't understand, they were arguing with Jesus. The Jews didn't understand that he was talking about the Father. I think these Pharisees did. These Pharisees very likely understood what Jesus meant, and they just refused to accept it. But Jesus, again, he's been making this point for 3 years. They knew what he was claiming. Now, this question of this question of the Pharisees here, this is the final question they're going to ask in John chapter 8. They leave the scene. They ask Jesus for the location of his Father. Now, this may well have been a subtle jab, an accusation against Jesus. Why? Well, his mother is known. Mary is known. But his physical father is not. Why is that? Well, Isaiah 7:14. It's the Holy Spirit provides 23 of those human chromosomes in the womb of Mary. And so there's no human father that's visible, because she's pregnant from the Holy Spirit. And so this, I think they intend this as a slur. And this slur against Jesus is picked up by the Jews. Remember, there's the leaders and then there's the Jews. The Jews are going to pick this up later in chapter 8 when they affirm that Abraham is their father, and they say to Jesus, they were not born of sexual immorality. Idea being, like you are. That's the suggestion. They're slurring Jesus because you don't even know who your father is. And so this is a slur. They are attacking Jesus as to his human father. Jesus ends the scene here by telling the Pharisees that they know neither him or his Father, and then once again he avoids arrest because his time hasn't come. Notice the text in verse 19. Jesus answered, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also." So Jesus closes out his brief debate here with the Pharisees by once again connecting himself to the Father. If you know the Son, you know the Father. If you know the Father, then you know the Son. But the Pharisees, they were only interested in their faulty human judgment, and so they persecuted God's Messiah. Back in chapter 5, Jesus told them that Moses would accuse them to the Father. These leaders in Jerusalem at the temple, they didn't know God the Father. They didn't know Jesus, and they didn't know Moses, in whom they put their trust. They are clueless in their unbelief. Now with verse 20, John the Apostle provides a little bit of a break in the action with his own comment of explanation. He does this throughout the gospel, and he does so again here. He says, notice verse 20, "These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple. But no one arrested him." Why? Because his hour had not yet come. Now remember, all of this is happening on the last and great day of the feast. Pilgrims from all over the Roman Empire arrived in Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And no doubt there are many coins that enter the treasury boxes in the temple. Now, maybe that's just a coincidence, but these leaders happen to be in the treasury. So I take this as, this is a big event. A lot of money is going to come into those treasury boxes during the feast. This is the last day of the feast. It's almost as though these leaders can't wait to get in there and count their coins, see how much the take was. And so they're in the treasury. They're trying to count their coins. Maybe this is where they regularly hang out. We don't know. D.A. Carson, in his commentary, describes this treasury as including 13 very large boxes, chests, each one that was topped with a shofar, like a trumpet. And so pilgrims could come, put their coins in the open end of the trumpet, and they would tinkle down into the box and drop down into the box. These were probably located in the court of the women. Why would you put it in the court of the women as opposed to the court of the men? Well, are women allowed in the court of the men? No. And you want to maximize your offerings, right? And we know from Luke that a widow went and put in her coins. So she was obviously in the court of women. So the treasury is probably in the court of women. They want to maximize their offerings that keep coming in. And so it's fascinating. They're keenly interested in what's going on in the treasury. So that's where they're located. But notice the last half of verse 20. It says, no one arrested him. Why? Because his time had not yet come. I just find this fascinating that John the Apostle, he's recording this decades after this event happened. But he keeps pointing this out. Remember back at verse 1 of chapter 7, the section started here with John saying that Jesus would not go about in Judea because the Jews are seeking to kill him. Then John reminded us in verse 13, yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. This is a hostile environment. And then in verse 30, on the middle day of the feast, John again comments, so they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him. And then, because his hour hadn't come, then in verse 44, on the last and great day of the feast, John once again interrupts to say some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. And then here again, at 8:20, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. Why does he keep saying this over and over? What does this tell us? I think probably John and the other disciples, they were flabbergasted that Jesus would even consider going to the Feast of Tabernacles. And so they heard the news, too, that, he couldn't walk in Judea out of fear of the Jews. And so, probably Jesus went alone to the feast. I think the disciples probably went for the first day. Jesus goes later, and he shows up in the middle of the feast and starts teaching. I don't think the disciples are with him initially. I think eventually, when they see that nothing has happened to him, they probably come out of the shadows, and they probably gather around Jesus at that point. And so as this action unfolds, John is just simply recounting over and over how the disciples were marveling that Jesus went to Judea, right into Jerusalem, right into the temple during the feast, and even went right into the heart of Judaism, the treasury, confronted the leadership personally, and was never arrested. So you can just imagine the disciples talking among themselves afterwards. Can you believe it? He did it. He went. He taught. He confronted the leaders. He was never arrested. I can't believe it. No one laid a hand on him. So I think this is something they probably viewed as nearly miraculous as Christ's sign miracles. And so later in John 11, in fact, we're going to see in John 11, the disciples still have a reluctance to go back to Judea because of the harm that waits for them there. So the reason he was able to do this here in John 7 and 8, go there and not be arrested, is the fact his hour had not yet come. John is reminding us that Jesus was in total control of this situation. He is sovereign. Yeah, he was not going to be arrested until the time was right. And so with this response of Jesus that these Pharisees, they didn't know him, they didn't know his Father. Apparently the chief priests and the Pharisees, they've heard enough. They leave the narrative for good, resulting in Jesus taking up the dialogue again with this group called the Jews. Now again, just for review, who are the Jews? I think these are underlings. You have the leadership, and you have these people called the Jews. I think they assist and they help the leadership. And I think they're probably informants. They're the ones who are the eyes and the ears of the leadership. That they're out among the people. And when they hear something that's not going right, they go back and they report it to the leadership. That's why it says people didn't speak openly about Jesus out of fear of the Jews, this group of people who work for the leadership. And so that's who Jesus is going to debate with now for the rest of the chapter 8. So notice verse 21. Jesus responds here, and he says to them again, I am going away, and you will seek me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come. So after Jesus is gone, these Jews are going to go right on seeking Messiah. But guess what? They're not going to find him. Why? They missed him. They persecuted him. They turned him over to the Romans for crucifixion. This is essentially the same thing that Jesus told the crowd back in chapter 7, verse 33. Jesus then said, I will be with you a little longer, and then I am going to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. But did you notice a key difference between that statement from chapter 7 and what we just read from chapter 8? One key difference. In chapter 8, verse 21, Jesus adds that they will die in their sin. What's that sin? It's the sin of unbelief. There is a permanent separation between God and the sinner who dies in his sin. The sinner who dies in his sin cannot come to where Christ is. And again, understand that the opportunity to experience a relationship with God is a fragile opportunity. Adam and Eve lost it in the Garden of Eden. Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone provides a means by which relationship to God can be restored. But it's a fragile opportunity due to the sin of unbelief. These religious leaders, more than anyone, should have been ready to welcome God's Messiah. They saw all the visible proofs for 3 years. They heard the teaching from Jesus himself, but they will die in their sin and never come to dwell with God in heaven. In our context, you sometimes will hear a person say, well, I can get saved whenever I want. You'll hear people say that sometimes. Folks, that's a dangerous proposition to make. The Spirit moves where he wills, and like the wind, you can't see where he comes from or where he goes. Salvation is a work of the Spirit. Anyone who thinks he is the master of his own regeneration, I think, thinks much like these first century Pharisees. They thought they knew the Father. They thought they knew the law of Moses, but they didn't. Jesus flatly tells them they will die in their sin and be forever separated from God. So how do the Jews then respond to this warning? Notice verse 22. So the Jews said, will he kill himself, since he says, where I am going, you cannot come? Now back in chapter 7, the Jews replied to that similar statement of Jesus by supposing that he would go out among the Gentiles and teach the Gentiles, and that's why he was going somewhere they couldn't come. Here, they openly raised the question of whether or not Jesus planned suicide. And once again, there's irony here, because it's true that Jesus will lay down his life, not as a suicide, but as a sacrifice. And the human agents allowed to bring this sacrifice to pass are these very Jews who accused Jesus of contemplating suicide. So notice the response then of Jesus in verse 23. Verse 23, he said to them, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. Jesus and these Jews come from incompatible opposite realms. In Christ is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. In these Jews is darkness, and there is no light at all. They are of the world. Jesus is not of this world. Now, this term world, we've already talked about this key word that John uses more than anyone else throughout the New Testament, this word cosmos, and how this term has such a wide range of meanings, all the way from a woman's personal adornment, where we get the term cosmetics, or it can mean the physical planet, or it can just mean people in general, as in mankind. It can also have the idea of totality, like when we say somebody is in a world of hurt. Or, as is most common the case, it is used, this term cosmos is used to describe secular society that is operating in complete opposition to God. And that's the nuance that John had in mind in his first epistle when he said, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. I think John Bunyan illustrated this idea in his Pilgrim's Progress, if you've ever read that book, he illustrated this idea of the world with a city called Vanity Fair. Remember that? All believers must pass through it, but woe to those who get bogged down and stay there to engage in all of the folly of pleasures and people who have no room for God. Jesus tells these Jews in John 8 that they are not who they think they are. They are, in fact, of this world system. Remember, 6 months later, these same Jews, from the chief priests all the way down, all of them with their own lips are going to cry out what? We have no king, but who? Caesar. For a Jew to say that, we have no king but Caesar, that tells you what? They are of this world system. Remember Pilate, he was minded to release Jesus. And so he put the question to them in John 19, verse 15. We'll get there in many weeks. Shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. They were of this world system. They were not from above. So it's really chilling when you stop to think about it. In our context, we in America, we have preachers every week who will stand in pulpits and tell the people that they should be people of this world, that they should go out and enjoy their best life now. But for the true believer, once we experience regeneration and conversion, which is a work of the Spirit, we move from the realm of darkness, from the realm of this world system, into the light of Jesus Christ, into the realm that is from above. And then by God's grace, we can walk right through Vanity Fair without stopping as we march on our way to the celestial city. It's not that we live as ascetics. We don't punish our bodies so that we're constantly experiencing hardship. No, we live lives of joy and contentment. Why? Because we are in the light. We're not captive to the trappings of this godless age. And just so there's no confusion among these Jews to whom Jesus is speaking, notice how in verse 24, and we need to close, notice in verse 24, Jesus plainly invites them to believe and thereby escape the death that comes through sin. Notice the text, verse 24. Therefore, I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. Okay, there's a lot to chew on here in verse 24. Earlier, Jesus referred to their singular sin of unbelief. Did you notice how Jesus here switches to the plural sins? He's highlighting the multitude of ways that they have fallen short. They have committed the sin of unbelief, and in fact, they are of this world, and their lives are saturated with multitudes of sins for which they are culpable, and so they will die. But Jesus, as he so often does, he keeps the invitation before them. Believe that Jesus is I am. Now, many translations will supply the word he. How many have a translation that has the word he after I am? Probably most translations. Well, the idea behind supplying the word he is the suggestion that Jesus is telling them to believe that he is who he says he is. He's the one from above. He's the one who's not of this world. In other words, Jesus is telling them to believe all that he has claimed about himself. Believe that I am he who I have claimed to be, and you will not die in your sins if you believe that. Now, that's good theology, and it's true. But is that exactly what Jesus meant here, or is he saying something more? Well, without the supplied third-person masculine pronoun here, the verse reads like this literally. Therefore, I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. So I think what Jesus has in mind here is the Hebrew name for God that he self-disclosed to Moses back in Exodus at the burning bush. I am that I am. So consider a verse like Isaiah 43, verse 10. That says, you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am. Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me. Isaiah 43:10. But having told this to the Jews, they don't understand it this way. They don't get it. They don't see that Jesus was referring back to the personal name that God gave to Moses in the wilderness. They probably understood it to mean that he was just saying, I am he, as in I am the Messiah. I am God's prophet. I am he whom God sent from above. That's probably how they understood it. Now, later on in John chapter 8, we're going to get there in a couple of weeks, at the very end, Jesus says to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, when he says that, they get it. They understand exactly what he is saying, that he is identifying himself with the I am of the Old Testament. How do we know that? At the end of chapter 8. As soon as Jesus says that, what do? They pick up stones to stone him. They wouldn't do that if they just thought he was saying, I am he. I am the one I'm claiming to be. They would still debate him. Once he says, I am the I am of the Old Testament, that's when they grab the stones to stone him. And so here, though, in this section, in verse 24, he says this, but it's a little less clear, and they don't understand it. They don't make that connection. But I think Jesus is starting this. He's laying this out as a seed thought. He's going to develop it throughout the rest of chapter 8, and then the punchline comes right at the end. And that's when they pick up the stones. But he starts it here. He is the I am. And so that is incredible Christology to think about. The God of the Old Testament, Jesus Christ, who throughout the Old Testament frequently would appear to some of God's people face to face, and we call that a Christophany, where he would appear and speak. Here he comes to the earth, spends 3.5 years authenticating who he is. And he always gives the invitation, just come and believe. Are you spiritually thirsty? Come and drink, believe. It's really simple if you stop to think about it. But to believe, someone has to abandon their life and repent of their sin and say, I am going to turn around. I am no longer going to pursue this life I have pursued, this world system. I'm going to abandon this world system and give myself to Christ. I'm going to receive Christ. I'm going to believe. And when you do that, Jesus tells you, you won't die in your sin. You will have life. You will bask in the light of life. And that's the message. Even in this very challenging moment, Jesus is standing in the treasury all alone. No one comes to testify on his behalf. He stands there. They're accusing him of horrible things, even accusing him of being born out of adultery. And he's taking all of this verbal abuse, but he still gives the invitation to believe. Come believe. It's incredible. What grace, what mercy he shows on these people. And so, for now, these Jews, they're a little bit confused. In the verse we're going to pick up with next week, they're going to ask him who he is, and it's going to continue to build until we get to that second climax, really, at the end of John chapter 8. So there's a lot more to talk about. These two incredible chapters in John's Gospel, only recorded in John's Gospel, this exchange at the Feast of Tabernacles, John chapter 7 and John chapter 8. Jesus is the light of the world. And what an incredible message these two chapters are for us. And so next time we'll pick up with verse 25, and we'll carry on probably about three more weeks in John chapter 8 to bring this all to a culmination. But let's go ahead then. We'll close in a word of prayer. And then any thoughts or comments before we close? I know I talk fast, and you have to listen fast. But incredible text. All right, let's go ahead and we'll close in a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your kindness to us. We thank you for this incredible text of Scripture, for these exchanges that Jesus Christ endured on our behalf, standing before people who he was right to judge, and yet he offered them the opportunity to believe. What a joy that just each day we think about the fact that you extended that offer to us to believe. And by your Spirit, by the working of the Spirit, we were drawn to the light, and we said, yes, Lord, I believe. I will leave behind this world of sin, and I will go hard after Jesus Christ. And when that happens, the Holy Spirit comes in to indwell. We're converted, we're regenerated, we're born again, and we can live in newness of life. We can enjoy and bask of being in the light, no longer being subject to this world, the world system, all of the opposition against you. Lord, what a joy to be content in your salvation. What a joy that is. And so we ask now your blessing as we go into the time of morning worship. May all that's said and done be pleasing to you. We thank you. We praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.